Welcome to the Health Trip Podcast. My name is Jill Foose. I'm a functional medicine and integrative nutrition health coach. I created this podcast to bring you along as we travel down intriguing, science-packed roads, debunking old medical paradigms and perusing new innovative therapies and modalities with the finest functional medicine doctors, practitioners, and like-minded biohackers while living our best life. Enjoy the show. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Health Trip Podcast. Today, we'll be diving into a topic that's often overlooked, the importance of gut health for women during the menopausal transition. OBGYNs, endocrinologists, and primary doctors are not specifically trained in gut health or nutrition, unless, of course, they've stepped out of their zone and has learned outside specialties. Your provider may tell you to eat better, but what the heck does that mean? The science is clear. Women's gut microbiomes change during perimenopause and look a lot like men's gut microbiomes. During menopause, women experience a laundry list of physiological hormonal changes. How do these changes impact gut health? And how does gut health, in turn, influence the menopause experience? The balance of estrogen and progesterone shifts, leading to changes in the gut microbiome. This fragile ecosystem of bacteria in your digestive tract plays a crucial role in not only digestion, but also in regulating hormones, supporting the immune system, and even affecting mental health. As estrogen levels take a massive dip, the diversity of gut bacteria can decrease, leading to issues like bloating, weight gain, brain fog, increased anxiety, sleep issues, and even increased inflammation. Today, we are going to explore how maintaining a healthy gut can ease some of the common symptoms of menopause. We'll also discuss practical strategies for supporting your gut health through diet, lifestyle changes, and possibly even supplementation. Whether you're currently navigating menopause or preparing for it, understanding the connection between gut health and hormonal balance is key to thriving during this transitional period. Kara Seidman is back on the Health Trip podcast to talk about menopause and gut health. You may have listened to our previous podcast on stool testing and the importance of personalizing your gut health protocol. Kara is a registered dietitian nutritionist, certified diabetes care and education specialist, and senior manager of scientific communications at Pendulum. Throughout her career, Kara has worked across diverse healthcare settings, from inpatient care to launching multiple outpatient programs in both diabetes management and gastroenterology. Her expertise lies in integrating functional and integrative approaches, particularly in the fields of gastroenterology and metabolic health. Before joining Pendulum, Kara worked in the microbiome field, sharing scientific insights and research with healthcare practitioners. She guided the practical use of various bacterial strains, which we're going to talk about, and microbiome-focused therapies in clinical practice, fueling her passion for translating this complex research into actionable guidance for healthcare providers. Just a short medical disclaimer before we dive in. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice or to make any lifestyle changes to treat any medical condition in yourself or others. Consult your physician for any medical issues that you may be having. And this entire disclaimer also applies to any of my guests on my podcast. So sit back, open your mind, and let's dive deep into the world of gut health during menopause. Hey, Kara, welcome back to the Health Trip Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you back and deep dive into gut health and menopause, because boy, is this a complex conversation to have. And women really need to understand what's going on with their bodies, with their gut, and their gut connection to all the other parts of our body while we're in this menopausal transition.
Absolutely. And I think we just have so much more knowledge now and really truly understanding what it means to have this foundation. And I always like to say, I think of the microbiome as our foundation, just like we think of our home. And if we have this big, beautiful home, that's amazing, but there's cracks or there's something going on in the foundation, we may not actually purchase it. And I think the microbiome is really that answer, right? It's you have to have this strong foundation, especially as we transition into these next phases of our life.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of information out there speaking to the gut microbiome changing during peri-menopause, and that it's turning into more of a looking more like a male microbiome. So I wanted you to sort of just give us the information about that, the science behind that. What is going on, and should we be worried?
I just think that's so funny. There have been studies looking at, especially as we get through menopause and we make that postmenopausal shift, that our microbiomes are very similar to that of a man. So I just makes me kind of laugh. But
Yeah.
it's this sort of natural transition and this natural shift of these declining hormones, right? We start to lose estrogen, we start to lose progesterone. And that natural decline is met with also this natural shift and decline in our microbiome. And we know that our microbiome is a key indicator in a lot of hormone regulation. And so, as we start to shift in our hormone production, our microbiome starts to lose diversity. We start to lose these keystone species and these health promoting species, species like Akkermansia and butyrate producing species that not just have profound influence on the health of the gut microbiome, but really have a profound influence beyond the microbiome. And so, as we lose this diversity, as we start to shift to a more dysbiotic state, we start to lose integrity of the microbiome, and this starts to drive inflammation and even immune activation beyond.
So do all women go through this same change during perimenopause, or women who have PCOS, or women who are vegans versus women who eat animal-based proteins? Does it look any different?
So there's going to be this natural decline, right? I mean, as we get into perimenopause and we're starting to see these shifts occur in hormone production, and especially as we transition into that menopause and even postmenopause state, we're going to be met with this sort of natural decline like it happens in our hormones. But I think that we can do a lot in that premenopause, perimenopause state to really strengthen and build the foundation so that maybe we don't have as much of a decline that we would naturally see. So there are so many different factors, of course, everything from, our stress and our diet, of course, what we eat, all these things that we know can disrupt the microbiome. If we can really start to work on building a strong foundation, then hopefully we aren't met with as many clinical symptoms. We aren't met with as much uh, problems and changes that we would naturally see. So ultimately, yes, there's this natural shift, but I think we can do a lot to prevent it from being so disruptive.
All right, so we're going to talk about keystone strains in a little bit, but I want to talk about some of the negative or problematic areas that having going through this transition, having our gut microbiome change in perimenopause. I want to talk about some of the things that could go wrong and that a lot of women are experiencing that sort of mimic symptoms of IBS or estrogen dominance, or just symptoms of menopause. So one of the things that we hear a lot about is increased gut permeability or leaky gut. Talk about that and explain what that is.
So leaky gut or or increased intestinal permeability, right? These are all kind of saying the same thing. What this is basically talking about is the change in our mucosal barrier, or the integrity of our gut barrier, which is really one of the most important characteristics of a healthy microbiome. So as our gut barrier is naturally this, semi-permeable structure that allows nutrients and water and things to move through, but it's really necessary to protect the microbiome and protect our immune system. So if we start to have a breakdown in that mucosal barrier, I think of like a fence. If your fence posts start getting knocked out, then what I'm protecting it within the fence, like my garden, isn't being protected beyond. So as we start to lose that integrity of the gut barrier, then things like bacteria and pathogens and bacterial toxins, LPS, lipopolysaccharides, these can then get into our immune system and start to really drive inflammation and immune activation to take place, which we don't just feel in the gut, but we feel that beyond, from changes to our mood to changes to our metabolic state. And this is really felt throughout the body.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do you know you even have a leaky gut? And I have a slide that I've made up for different presentations, and it shows things like rashes, right?
Yep,
Eczema, psoriasis, joint
yep,
pain. For me, it was hair loss.
yep.
For other people, it could be other symptoms going on. So, really tuning into the changes going on physiologically. If you have chronic migraines, sleep
Yep.
issues, mood disturbances, what else should we be thinking?
Well, and I just love it so much because I've had so many patients that are like, I have a gut of steel. And I'm like, well, tell me what else is going on, right? Like, do you ever experience changes in your sleep? And so I think it's really sort of misunderstood in that you have to have GI issues to have a dysfunctional gut. But we
Right.
know our gut is connected to just about every organ of the body. And so it might be changes, like you said, in sleep. It might be changes in our ability to absorb and digest. So obviously changes to your digestive system. It could be changes to your liver. It could be weight changes. It could be changes to your blood sugar. We could see changes to our other hormones throughout the body. And especially when we talk about this shift into perimenopause, into menopause, if you have a dysfunctional gut, then that really can lend itself to even further symptoms that mimic estrogen dominance and even contribute to estrogen dominant related conditions. So it's so important that we don't just look at how we feel in our gut as a determinant of whether or not we have leaky gut or we have a dysfunctional gut barrier.
Yeah. And a lot of women during this phase of life are gaining weight and they're saying, I haven't changed anything. I'm eating the same breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm doing the same workout every day. I have the same exact sleep. Like nothing is changing in my lifestyle. Yet every year I'm putting on 3 to 5 pounds. And by, year five, maybe that's 15 to 30 pounds for somebody. So, what is that connection to our gut health?
So I love that because it's really time we start to think of the gut as part of our interventions, as part of our toolbox when working with all sorts of patients, not just people who are dealing with hormone imbalance, not just people who are dealing with metabolic dysfunction, but really all patients, because we now understand that the gut is connected. So I always thought about this with my patients so much because they're like, what do you do? What do I do? Like I'm trying my hardest. So ultimately, if we have a dysfunctional gut, especially if we have this breakdown in our mucosal barrier, we have a breakdown in our gut barrier, and we have this loss of keystone species, right? Akkermansia is one of the most important species in the microbiome because it helps to fortify that gut barrier, but it's also helpful in making sure that we have proper function of these key pathways that are related to metabolic health and related to appetite and related to weight, like GLP-1 production and everything in between, and insulin, blood sugar regulation, and all of that. So we really have to key in on first of all, who are we missing? What are we feeding them? And are we really supporting the bugs within to make sure that our metabolic health, our blood sugars, our weight are actually properly functioning correctly?
Yeah, maybe this is a good time to just sort of veer off my outline here and talk more about those GLP-1s and the relationship to akkermansia. And you're at Pendulum, so you guys are at the forefront of making akkermansia that people can actually take because while some people might make the proper amount that they need in terms of the GLP-1, because that is a hormone that we make in our gut,
Mhm.
some people don't make what they need and have to look for outside support. So, talk about that connection between akkermansia, the lining of our gut, the production of GLP-1 from a very non medical layman term approach.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of this twofold approach, right? So you have your gut barrier, which is essentially your security system, your
Your
perimeter.
fence.
Yep, your fence that protects what's happening in your microbiome from what's happening in your immune system. And they've done studies, we mentioned some of those bacterial toxins and pathogens that once they get into the immune system can start to trigger inflammation. And we see that even precipitating things like weight changes, and we see that precipitating things like blood sugar changes. But we're also keyed into these very specific microbes and species that actually help to boost that natural production. So most people don't know that we make GLP-1 in the
Right.
gut from our intestinal cells. And so Akkermansia in particular is super unique in that it has this kind of twofold approach. It consumes mucin, so it actually helps to consume the mucus that's part of that gut barrier to regenerate new mucus. So really fortifying that fence, making sure those fence posts are strong and in place. But then it also has this other side of it of in terms of the byproducts that Akkermansia produces. Okay. So Akkermansia is really this kind of twofold approach, right? It can stimulate mucin, it can help to rebuild that mucus barrier by consuming mucus. It's one of the only microbes that actually consumes mucus. It can also feed off of dietary polyphenols, which we can talk more about. But Akkermansia also produces these key byproducts or proteins that also play a key role in our metabolic health. And one is this AMUC 1100. So it's just a what we call a postbiotic or a byproduct or a compound that we know microbes can produce. AMUC 1100 is unique in that it helps to fortify the gut barrier even further. But it also binds to receptors in the intestinal cells that actually help to protect our immune system and help to encourage our immune system to be balanced. But Akkermansia also produces propionate, which is a short chain fatty acid, essentially a chemical messenger that actually feeds to produce butyrate, which is our key short chain fatty acid that just has far reaching effects and benefits in the body. But one of the important components of butyrate is it actually binds to specific receptors to stimulate the production of GLP-1. And then third is this very unique protein called P9. And P9 binds to different receptors on our intestinal cells that specifically stimulate GLP-1. So we're getting this sort of multi-prong approach with Akkermansia in not just its fortification and ability to secure that intestinal barrier, to prevent toxins, to keep our microbiome safe, to protect our immune system, but also these key proteins that it produces that specifically work on receptors to stimulate GLP-1 production naturally.
So, if we back up to how this process even starts, how it gets triggered, it's through eating food, correct?
So that's one. We know that Akkermansia specifically feeds on what's called polyphenols. Polyphenols are specific nutrition components that are found in, think of your berries and green tea and all those wonderful foods we eat. But what's unique about Akkermansia is it doesn't need that. It consumes that mucus. So it basically consumes old mucus
Ah.
to regenerate new mucus. So that's what's super unique about Akkermansia. So people who start to have a breakdown in that mucosal barrier or start to have leaky gut, or let's say we're surrounded by all these insults around us, or we're going through these natural shifts in our hormones, we start to lose that mucosal integrity. And so then we start to lose Akkermansia. And they've actually done studies in showing that as we transition from perimenopause to menopause, that we see a reduced abundance or a reduction in the amount of Akkermansia that's there. So Akkermansia is really important, not just for that gut barrier fortification, but it's important, especially when we talk about those metabolic changes that are also naturally they're naturally occurring during this time of hormonal shifts.
Oh, that is so interesting. I actually wasn't aware that we didn't need to stimulate akkermansia by eating certain foods. That's one way, that's one pathway, but our body just naturally, if we have the appropriate amount of akkermansia, is doing this job anyway.
It is, and that's actually something that comes up a lot because there are products, right? So here at Pendulum, we manufacture and produce live Akkermansia, which is unique. These are strict anaerobes, so they survive at the very, very end of your, large intestine where there's no oxygen. So it's really unique how we manufacture these. But there are other companies that actually have pasteurized Akkermansia or dead Akkermansia, because we now know that microbes, when they're dead, can actually retain some function, usually maybe just one function. But live Akkermansia can actually work with our nutrition. So if we consume polyphenols, yes, it's eating that mucus and eating that mucin within the mucosal barrier, but it's also going to eat the polyphenols that are coming in to maintain those levels and to maintain its abundance. So it really needs both. I mean, we can take Akkermansia, right? And in order for it to continue to build in abundance, it's really going to help. It's really going to utilize the diet that's coming in. Whereas if you have dead Akkermansia or you have pasteurized Akkermansia, it's not going to be able to consume that mucin. It's not consuming the diet. It's only really having a very small function. And the function is really in this production of one of the proteins that actually can help to fortify the barrier, but that's it. So I always kind of use the analogy of it's like eating a whole fruit where you're getting all of the benefits that fruit has to
Mhm.
offer versus just drinking the juice, where yes, you may get some of the vitamins and some of the minerals, but that's it.
So if someone was to supplement with akkermansia, is this something that they're going to have to do for the rest of their life? Or is it sort of like you're going to repopulate this colony of this keystone strain? And once you repopulate this colony, you're good to go and can sort of wean off akkermansia? Or is it more transient that you're going to continuously need it?
So Akkermansia is like pretty much all of our other probiotics where they're transient. But like other probiotics, lactobacillus strains, bifido strains, it's going to utilize the diet coming in to establish itself. And we're actually doing clinical studies to look at this, to really understand what it takes to have Akkermansia establish itself and to what it takes to actually maintain that abundance. So it's really individualized because if you think of the things that impact and drive insult to the microbiome, everything from stress to what we're eating, to things like travel, to
Medication?
medications and alcohol
Hmm.
and all of the above,
Yep.
that's going to impact its abundance. So I never like to say that we have to take something forever, but if you want to ensure that you are fortifying your gut barrier, you want to have the metabolic benefits that we see with Akkermansia, to me, then it's just easier to supplement with it to maintain those benefits and to achieve those effects.
Yep. And this is why those GLP-1 incretin, that class of medication, works so well because not everybody can make these GLP-1s in optimal amounts, but it sure sounds like akkermansia is a first line to start with.
Absolutely. And we actually recently just did a survey among healthcare practitioners and those that are using these GLP-1 agonists and
Hmm.
these medications in how they're actually utilizing Akkermansia and our butyrate producing strains, and that they're actually seeing benefits as people are transitioning off medications. They're starting patients on
Mm.
Akkermansia, they're starting patients on our GLP-1 probiotic to help to maintain that reduction in food cravings and to actually help maintain weight that's being lost by encouraging that endogenous or that internal production, that natural production of GLP-1. But I always say these medications are great. They've really changed, some of the hardships and some of the
Yep.
some of the difficulty that we've had in the blood sugar regulation or the weight loss world, but we still have to take care of the microbiome because it's still part of that foundation. So to me, if we're seeing great success with these medications and people are utilizing them, the microbiome still has to be part of the picture and
Yep.
making sure that we're supporting it. And in fact, this is one of the most, I love this study they did on Akkermansia, where they took obese subjects and they measured Akkermansia levels within those subjects. And they essentially found that even though these subjects were obese, those that had higher abundance or higher levels of Akkermansia were metabolically healthier, which is our ultimate goal. Like, of course, we want
Right.
to look good. Of course, we want to lose weight, but we really want people to be healthier. So, having those higher levels or higher abundance of Akkermansia actually shifted people to a more metabolically healthier state. So, I found that super unique because, yes, they were still obese. So, they still have this risk of other metabolic dysfunction, but Akkermansia actually showed that it protected and prevented that.
Oh, that's a very cool study.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Let's shift to bone health degradation and the connection to gut health. So a lot of women going through perimenopause and hitting postmenopause um, become osteopenic, right?
Mhm.
They find out they have osteoporosis, and they get very nervous and upset. I found out I have osteopenia on both my hips.
Yeah.
So I have that's a risk factor, even though that's not a medical term.
Mm.
It's something that's used now. So for me, I always think about what can I do in terms of my gut health
Mhm.
to support my bone health. So talk about the interconnection, the interplay between vitamin D, calcium, K2. There's a lot of controversy over taking calcium.
Yep.
So just I'm going to turn this over to you.
Yeah, so I think this is like a twofold answer because we're learning more. We understand there's this sort of gut bone axis now. And we know that as we start to lose hormones, right? As our hormones shift, right, we get this rapid drop in estrogen and progesterone. So it's very stressful on the body. And we start to lose this skeletal muscle mass. And one of the key players in that is actually butyrate, which we mentioned before being
Mm,
this key short chain fatty acid, this postbiotic that comes from different strains. We have prominent butyrate producers that we manufacture at Pendulum, one being Clostridium butyricum, which is really one of the most like prominent butyrate producers we can have. And they find that butyrate actually helps to preserve skeletal muscle mass. So I think, again, as we lose diversity, as we lose these key health promoting species, as we increase gut permeability, that's naturally going to drive this dysfunction to the bone. So I think if we can really work on that prior to this change, this natural shift, we can hopefully help to preserve some of that. And then it's the other side of it, right? So things like vitamin D and calcium and K2, which we know are essential for bone health, K2 being something that we only make by our microbiome. We do get it in some foods, but I don't know many of us who are consuming natto every day and
Right.
have even tried it. It
Yeah,
definitely
it's gross.
it's an acquired taste.
Yeah, it's tough.
It is, and I love fermented foods, and even when we were
Mhm.
in Japan, I was like, "Okay, like, this is an acquired taste." So, if we have dysbiosis, if we have changes in that microbial ecosystem, then we may actually not be producing endogenous K2, and K2 is really that we call it, like, the Uber driver or the taxi driver that takes calcium out of the vessels, your heart vessels, right, preventing things like atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease, and puts it into the bone and delivers it to other parts of the body. So K2 essentially activates those vitamin K dependent proteins so that this process can happen and drive calcium to where it needs to go. So there is controversy around calcium supplementation and calcium supplementation alone. So not something that I would recommend, but of course, our calcium needs, depending on your diet, depending on what phase of life we're in, are going to change. So if we're taking calcium, we also want to make sure we have that trifecta of calcium, vitamin D3, and K2.
Yeah. So what are the recommendations for calcium coming through your diet for like perimenopausal and postmenopausal women?
So I'd have to go back into my like nutrition brain bank as far as what the milligrams. I think it's 1,200 to 1,500
Yeah.
milligrams of calcium per day is what's recommended. And if we think of our calcium containing foods, everything from, right, of course, broccoli and some of our green vegetables contain calcium, but our dairy being its most predominant source. So I always say, to me, we got to look at the diet, like how much dairy are we consuming? If we're concerned, I'm fine with calcium supplementation. But we just don't want to do it alone. And I wouldn't go, above certain amounts, especially depending on how much you're taking in the diet. But the key factor there being if you're going to take calcium as a supplement, depending on medications, again, if we're into this sort of osteopenic or moving more into an osteoporosis state, then calcium is very necessary. But make sure we have D3, make sure we have K2, so that calcium is actually getting delivered to the bone where
Right.
it needs to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, food is always going to be the best bet, right? But not everybody has the diet that's going to get all the nutrients that you need in all the amounts in the right forms, right?
Absolutely. And
It's challenging.
it is, and I don't even think it's I mean, I always am food first, and what can we optimize from the diet because it's gonna be the most bioavailable
Yeah.
version, but, again, like, it's really hard to get calcium, the recommended calcium. It's really hard to get the recommended fiber. All these kind of shifting ideas and views on diet alone is really shifting, how much we're getting. So I don't necessarily think we can get everything from the diet. But I think you have to look at your diet individually to say, okay, well, how much calcium am I actually consuming to where maybe I need to supplement a little bit. And I always say supplementing with some is better than oftentimes supplementing with nothing because you are going to get a decent amount from your diet.
Yeah, I think working with a provider who really understands
Yep.
bone health is key to this
And
equation.
and also if we're avoiding certain foods, right? We have many
Yep.
people who avoid dairy for
Yep.
specific reasons, then that
Me.
absolutely right. I always say as supplements have two definitions, right? To replace something that's missing, right? Because we cannot get it or we don't get it from the diet, or we use it to gain therapeutic value or have a therapeutic effect because we want something above what we may be able to get in the diet alone. So absolutely. And I think you have to work with a provider. You have to look at the diet, not just, day to day, but really over the course of a couple of weeks to figure out, are we actually getting enough of these things? And there are certain things like K2 and D3 that we just cannot get enough of in the diet.
Yeah, I definitely take those together as a supplement for my calcium. I'm one of those people that is dairy free. So I'm always prioritizing salmon, canned sardines,
Yep.
mackerel, tuna. I try to go that route to get in all of my calcium needs.
Yeah.
But
So it might
not, but
not be
it's not
something.
every day. It's not
Yeah.
every day. And I do have osteopenia. So I do, it's a priority for me. Let's switch to the gut vaginal microbiome connection, because I think this is a really fascinating connection. And maybe you want to, I might have you even weave in the estrobolome, because
Absolutely.
that is a hot topic right now. And it's something that a lot of women are unaware of. I bring it up a lot in my presentations on gut health. But I would love to hear from you. Let's start there. Let's start with the estrobolome. You mentioned a little bit of it without mentioning the word earlier in the podcast,
Yes.
but let's dive into that, and then let's move down into the vaginal canal.
So I love this could be probably my most favorite term in the microbiome world right now
I agree.
is the strobolome. And
Mhm.
essentially all the estrobolome is it's your estrogen microbiome. And so we have all these different microbiomes. We understand our microbiomes connected. We have our skin microbiome, our oral microbiome. We have a vaginal microbiome, but we also have this estrogen microbiome, which is the estrobolome. So the estrobolome is basically the part of your gut microbiome that handles and manages estrogen metabolism. So we know estrogen gets metabolized through the liver through phase one, phase two detoxification. And you'll hear often people saying it gets packaged up into a
Yes.
box with a bow. And
Thank
it
you,
gets,
Carrie Jones.
yes, I know. I do love that. She has
Uh-huh.
amazing analogies.
Yes.
But basically, it's marked for removal. And we know that our phase three detoxification, which is our intestine, right, which is where we excrete through stool. So within the gut
Wait,
microbiome,
and I want to stop there for a second. This is why I ask my women clients, how are your bowel movements?
yeah,
Are you pooping every day? Because some people say, oh, no, I'm still normal twice a week. And that's not normal.
no. And constipation, everyone thinks of constipation as like not pooping or having these hard poops. Constipation's beyond that. Are you having are your bowel movements incomplete? Are you having difficulty getting it out? Constipation, I've had patients who've had diarrhea, right? We call it overflow diarrhea, who have diarrhea, who go 10 times a day, but they're actually constipated. So constipation looks different in everyone. And so we really have to be asking ourselves, how many bowel movements are we having today? But more importantly, do they feel complete? Are we getting it all out? We all know, a lot of us know what it feels like to
Yep.
not get it all out. And to me, I generally, this is my personal, sort of area of working with patients, but a lot of times when we're talking about detoxification, when we're talking about even estrogen, we think of like, okay, what's happening phase one, phase two, but we almost want to flip it, right? If you're not pooping, if you're not getting it out, you're not detoxing. If you're not excreting it, you're not getting rid of it, right? You're not getting rid of
Right.
those estrogens that need to get out, or any toxins for that matter.
Right.
So that to me is number one. We've got to get people to poop, because even more so if we're constipated, that can actually then trigger more dysbiosis and kind of just, perpetuate this sort of vicious cycle that we see. So once those estrogens are packaged and marked for removal and they get sent through our biliary system into the intestine, that's essentially where we poop it out. But the estrobolome, which is this group of bacteria, so lots of different bacteria that have what's called beta glucuronidase activity. And beta glucuronidase basically um, works to, if we have a lot of this bacteria that produce beta glucuronidase, it basically unties the bow and releases that estrogen back into circulation. And this can be one thing that can increase estrogen dominance or play a key role in estrogen dominant related symptoms, right? Fibroids or PMS, mood changes, weight changes. So if that beta glucuronidase is elevated, a lot of us do stool testing. If your estrobolome is elevated or if your beta glucuronidase is elevated, then essentially you have a lot of this bacteria that's untying all these boxes and putting more of it into circulation. And this can essentially lead to higher estrogen levels in the body. And so it's really important that, we take into account what's happening there in the estrobolome, things like constipation, digestive distress, right? Even other symptoms that are related to GI dysfunction, to give us an idea of, our estrobolome, and kind of give us an idea if potentially we're having issues with our estrobolome.
And
But
what are things that could cause the estrobolome to not function as well as it should? Like, are we looking at environmental factors like certain medications, birth control, stress,
all of it.
poor diet, sedentary lifestyle,
Yep.
bad sleep, all of it?
All of it, right? Your
Mhm.
diet, diet is one of the biggest key, right? Like same thing when we look at the things that disrupt hormones or we look at what disrupts a lot of things, they what we call these modifiable risk factors, or I call them microbiome disruptors, smoking, travel, right? Stress. This is all going to change that balance of your gut microbiome, which in turn is going to affect your strobilum. Your strobilum is made up of lots of different bacteria. Actually, it's not all bad. And in fact, in sort of the menopause, the postmenopausal state, you do want, I mean, it's okay to have some of those estrogens go back into circulation because you have very low estrogen levels. It's
Mm,
not all that bad. But
mhm.
if you have too much of this bacteria, and especially some of the bacteria that possess a lot of this beta glucuronidase activity can also be more pathogenic in nature, it's just going to drive inflammation and start to increase that immune activation that can take place.
Very, very interesting. I have a question that I did not have on my outline for you, but I am going to ask it.
Mhm.
Why is it when people travel, like myself, we become more constipated?
So I think there's a varying factors. And I know like this has been asked a lot. I think for one, traveling is naturally sort of stressful on the
Mhm,
body.
mhm.
It creates almost like sometimes psychological stress, right? Which we know can impact our gut. But I also think it comes down to like, what do we eat? What don't we eat? Are we drinking enough water? Do we hydrate? So I think there's a lot of different factors that really truly change the integrity and the transit time within the microbiome. So I think ultimately the first thing we have to look at when we travel is, do we drink enough water? Are we getting hydration? Because that's really key, number one. Are we eating the same way? Are we eating consistently? Do we feel more stress? Because that, again, if we're stressed, which impacts our nervous system, our vagus nerve is a key regulator of intestinal transit time. So stress is going to slow your intestinal transit. So we have to keep all those things in mind. And I kind of go through that mental checklist of like, and me personally, when I travel, like I don't drink for whatever reason. I don't know if it's just because I don't have like my usual water bottle with me. I have no idea what it is, but I find for me, it's mostly dehydration that plays a role in that.
Yeah. It's frustrating because we're going on these wonderful vacations and, we can't poop and it's like annoying. And I want to talk about some practical strategies that women who suffer like myself with this can put into play. Should we be taking a metamucil? Should we be taking psyllium husk? Like, are there any supplements that are beneficial for us to use in those types of scenarios?
So yes, I mean, I think for one, like I always travel with electrolytes. I always
Yep.
travel with minerals to replenish because we're not drinking enough. Again, water changes, all those things. So I think that's really key, like hydration, hydration, hydration. I think fiber supplements, obviously on an individualized basis are can be necessary. When we travel, our diets maybe not as on point. We maybe don't consume as much. We're consuming different types of foods. So I think there's various types of fiber supplements out there. I think depending on if you have GI issues, you may go towards one over the other. I love things like partially hydrolyzed guar gum. I love, there's varying prebiotics out there, and Metamucil's fine if that's what you want to consume, but it may be helpful as long as you're getting your hydration. Because if you take fibers and you don't have enough, right, that pulls water, right? So it dehydrates your bowels actually even more. So you have to make sure your hydration's on point when you're taking those fibers.
Yeah, very good strategy there. I want to circle back to microbial diversity and how this becomes more of a challenge for women in menopause. And you talked about keystone strains and one of them being Akkermansia. What are some of the other strains that play an integral role in our microbiome and in our overall health and wellness as we age?
So, yeah, keystone strains. And so, for those of us, that's a term like all ecosystems that exist have keystone species, or I think of them as like the star player on a sports team where their presence is really there to help drive success. And so keystone species, there's lots of different types of keystone species, Akkermansia being kind of like the shining star of the gut microbiome. We have other keystone species like Faecalibacterium prausnitzii and bifidobacterium, and all these very important, what we often are consuming in our probiotics that are essential and really determine the overall health of the microbiome. We have these strong butyrate producers and short chain fatty acid producers like Clostridium butyricum that are so essential. Because if we start to lose these species, if we start to have a decrease or a change in the abundance of these species, this really has a profound shift in the overall health. So they don't actually take up a huge amount of real estate. They're not the most abundant strains in the microbiome, but they have a disproportionate benefit on the overall health of the microbiome. They help to maintain the pH so that our microbiome isn't as friendly to pathogens, and they're really implicated and help to prevent a lot of chronic conditions.
So let's talk about a couple ways in order to ensure that we're going to keep these keystone strains around and make sure that they're doing their job. One obviously is through diet, right? So let's start with practical steps and strategies for women during this menopausal transition. What are we supposed to be focusing on in our diet?
So number one, fiber. I mean, we all talk about it. If I don't think if you ever hear any conversation or any discussion going on in the microbiome that fiber isn't being discussed. We know fiber is important. It's something that most people do not get enough of. And not because we're not trying. Like I almost think of it as like the sort of unhealthy healthy diet where we do consume vegetables and fruits, but we just don't get the variety that we're looking to achieve. And so I always say the more colorful your diet, the better. I often give my patients, handouts of all the different types of complex fibers out there. And I challenge people to try to consume, 5 new fibers, a day or a week or whatever our goal is, because we want to work incrementally. And that's really important. So fiber is number one. We shouldn't be afraid of carbohydrates. We shouldn't be afraid of fiber. And I think that's unfortunately where a lot of our society and a lot of our sort of nutrition views have changed. We hear protein, 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 and then fat, and then, carbohydrates just keep kind of getting lumped
Push
down.
down.
But they're
Mhm.
important and you have to choose the right one. So I think first and foremost, like, what are we consuming? And then secondly, a lot
Well,
of
wait,
people.
let's how much fiber is
Yep.
optimal for a menopausal woman?
So in general, I would say our goal is to get anywhere between 25 grams to even 40 grams a
Mhm.
day of fiber. 40 grams is where we actually start to see a lot of the metabolic benefits of fiber. So that's a lot, right? Like, I mean, I think of like it's not achievable, right? So I just gave my little daughter a piece of Dave's Killer Bread for breakfast. Like one slice of that has actually a pretty significant amount of fiber. We just have to be conscious. Like where can we add chia seeds? Like where can we add something to what we're already eating that may boost our fiber, right? Maybe we make this beautiful salad at lunch. Can we add different beans and seeds? Can we add some different types of ancient grains to it even to help boost that fiber component?
Yeah, those are great ideas. I've recently started adding flaxseed meal into my smoothies, and I put in a scoop of that. I'm getting 7 grams of fiber. It's like a
A
no
lot.
brainer for me. It's super easy.
Yeah.
I do try to bring in a lot of variety of fruits and vegetables, and I'll be transparent here. Years ago I was a carnivore. And I felt great. And I only ate from the animal kingdom. But I feel, I got really bored within the 18 months or 2 years that I did that. And but I did feel really good. And I see the draw to that type of reset or lifestyle. But I have come to really understand how important the fiber, soluble and insoluble fiber is, especially as a menopausal woman. I put on a little weight in the beginning of this transition. My sleep was off, my skin, my hair, like lots of things were happening to me. And as soon as I stabilized my nutrition, my plan with more fiber, I immediately felt better. My poops every day now, like clockwork.
Yeah, and I mean that really goes to show, like that really tells you how much your
Yep.
microbiome is your foundation. And that's the thing, like even my patients who come to me who are like, I feel great, on this diet. That's why we have supplements, right? Like, I mean, that's ultimately why then we have fiber supplements and we have different types of fiber supplements that we can then add in. Because who am I to argue with someone who's like, hey, I feel really good on this diet and really don't have any issues. Well, what can I do to protect my microbiome? We have options out there. And I think that's what you have to look at it. Or you have to take a step back and say, well, is the diet you're consuming actually really feeding you and feeding your body? Or do you have other symptoms that, like we talked about earlier, could actually be stemming from a dysfunctional microbiome? So I think that's, really important when we take a step back because it's not a one size fits all model.
Yep.
But it's just, I love that because it really leans into your microbiome as your foundation. We know that we have certain microbes that produce neurotransmitters, and especially this transition into menopause or perimenopause into menopause, it's met with not just physiological stress, but it's also at a time in our life where we are naturally stressed out, right? It's kids are in school and we're in our career and all these things are going on, and that actually changes some of these neurotransmitter production, and it changes the way our HPA axis works, and that can drive leaky gut even further. And so we just kind of get stuck in this vicious cycle, which then really manifests itself as symptoms.
Yeah, I love knowing that eating all this fiber, both the soluble and the insoluble, I love that they are there's prebiotics that feed the microbial diversity that we're talking about. It's the
Yep.
food for them. And
Mhm.
I think, I'm going to gift them what they need so they gift me back with
I
all
love that.
these really positive physiological feelings that I get, right? My skin health, my
I love
hair
that.
health, my muscle health, helps me maintain my weight, helps me maintain my insulin resistance, which I do have. So a lot of good things come out of taking a step back and analyzing what's best for you.
And what diet you consumed 10 years ago is not the same diet we need
Right.
to consume 10 years later. And a lot of
100%.
times I'll hear people say, "Well, I try to eat more fiber and I don't feel good. I don't feel as good." Well, then we have to start to ask ourselves, "Well, who don't we have in there that's needed to actually break down those fibers?" And that's really kind of a big question, because I've had so many patients and clients and people come to me and say, "Well, I started eating more fiber and then I developed digestive distress." Well, that tells
Yes.
me you're missing these keystone species, these key microbes or bifidobacterium. Like we manufacture and put into our one. We have a strain that we put into our probiotics, this Bifidobacterium infantis. And the reason we add that into our products, in a few of our products, is because it's a primary degrader. So it's actually there to be that initial microbe that breaks down those fibers so that Akkermansia or Clostridium butyricum can use it to further produce those short chain fatty acids. So if we're consuming fiber and we don't feel good, well, then that really keys us in that something is going on in the microbiome.
Right, you're absolutely right. That's such a great point. People have SIBO or they have IBD, colitis, or Crohn's, and so those things need to be addressed. And you and I did a previous podcast on stool testing, which is a
Mhm.
wonderful way. It's a beneficial test to look at. It's not 100% perfection, but it certainly gives you some insight into who are all the neighbors in the big neighborhood, right? That you've taught me that.
Yep, it gives us a little bit of a
Yeah.
snapshot to just try to personalize our approach as we work with individual people and as we work through different stages of life. And so I don't always think it's necessary. And I think sometimes, again, it's a snapshot and our microbiome can shift very rapidly. But really, to get that long-term change, to really, really change, your overall state of the microbiome, it does take some time. So stool
Yeah.
testing can be helpful to direct that. And we now have better insight into which microbes are playing a key role in certain health conditions. So we've talked a lot about metabolic health and the changes that occur with not just as we enter into menopause, but just natural issues that we have with difficulty losing weight. We can actually look at certain microbes like Akkermansia and your butyrate producers to give us insight into, well, if you don't have them there, well, no wonder why we're struggling with weight loss. No wonder why we have increased food cravings. No wonder why we're dealing with some of this dysfunction despite our best efforts.
Absolutely. What about the importance of probiotic rich foods, including fermented foods?
So fermented foods are great. You're going to get different lactobacillus. You have different strains there. It's just you're not getting all the strains necessary. So something like we've talked a lot about Akkermansia. Akkermansia is not found in food, right? Or there's different probiotics that are just not found in food. So I think fermented foods are a part of a healthy diet. You're going to get different strains that you may not be able to find in other supplements. And we know that they're beneficial for our gut health. So I think it needs to be part of a healthy diet. But don't worry if you don't like them, because we have supplements then to help to replenish that. But not all probiotics are found in fermented food. So I've had a lot of people that will say, "Well, I don't take probiotics because I eat a lot of fermented food." That's great. You're just not going to get the diversity that we really want to see,
Mm,
that we know is often lost, and we know that can be changed from things like medications or stress, all these things that we talked about that disrupt the microbiome.
yeah, well, that's important to know. What about healthy fats? What is their role in optimal gut health?
So I love this question because I think fat, there's a lot of varying opinions of like, eat only this fat and eat only that fat. And they've done studies, they've looked at studies that have sorry. So they've done studies in looking at fat's role in the microbiome. For one, we know our omega-3 fatty acids, which obviously have key roles in cardiovascular health and brain health, but we know actually our omega-3 fatty acids are important for gut health. So they help to fortify that mucus barrier. They help to replenish microbiota and almost having prebiotic properties. So omega-3 fatty acids have actually been shown to help stimulate akkermansia and support akkermansia levels in the body as well. But then they've also done studies in looking at saturated fat. And so I always like to talk about the role of saturated fat in driving um, gut dysfunction and driving this condition known as metabolic endotoxemia. And metabolic endotoxemia is essentially this innate immune response that occurs from having a dysfunctional gut, where we mentioned before those tiny bacterial components, LPS, lipopolysaccharides, get into circulation and start to drive low grade chronic inflammation. And they found that saturated fat actually increases that process more. And so it's interesting because there's been a lot of talk on, coconut oil and things like that. And I think ultimately it comes down to, well, if you have a dysfunctional gut, we really should be emphasizing your omega-3 fatty acids because those actually have a more positive effect on your microbiome. They can actually help to detoxify LPS. They almost have prebiotic properties. They actually help to stimulate mucus regeneration in the mucus barrier. So we really want to emphasize that. And as we improve and replenish and restore the gut microbiome, then maybe we can incorporate some of those saturated fats back in. But I'm always a fan of balance, right? We shouldn't emphasize one over the other, and we need to look at what we're getting more of. And if we have these dysfunctions that are taking place, then we need to start to put a little bit more emphasis on some of those more beneficial fats, your omega-3 fatty acids, things like your omega-9, your avocado oils and your olive oils, your fatty fish, which we know are a little bit harder to get in the diet.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I am a Midwestern ribeye girl myself, but I have the past year made a decision to try to eat more lean red meat when I do eat red meat. Um, but I do treat myself to a ribeye once in a while, right?
Absolutely.
The 80-20 rule. I'm not going to totally give them up because I do a lot of good things for
Exactly.
foundational health. Yeah. So I really like that you're not excluding one group over the other. Just making sure you prioritize your health, fix things, heal things, and then you can maybe sprinkle some other things in.
Yeah, and I think that balance is so key. I mean, we look
Yeah.
to have balance in everything. Like even good things that, in the gut can turn bad, right? Like, I mean,
Yep.
balance is everywhere, even in hormones, right? Balance is key. And our body has this sort of natural and innate way of maintaining that balance until it doesn't. So if we're dealing with issues, those may be times that we have to make shifts and we have to maybe say goodbye to things that we love for a short period of time or
Yep.
just reduce them for a short period of time, but it doesn't ever mean that these things go away. And so I really try to emphasize that in everything we do is where's that balance? And sometimes in certain periods of life, we just have to emphasize certain things a little bit more.
Yep. And you mentioned that protein is sort of getting a big spotlight out there, especially in menopausal health, right? We need to eat optimal amounts of protein to protect and maintain our musculoskeletal system, our lean muscle mass. Is the building block of all proteins, right? So we need it for our tissues, our organs, our cells, all this stuff going on in our body. What is the role that protein plays on our gut health?
So protein, of course, like, I mean, again, I never discriminate against any food group. We need protein, we need fat, right?
Yep.
We need carbohydrates. But I think protein does sort of, we get almost into this sort of carb phobic state, and protein, does have this sort of shining light. It should be part of every meal. I always say we should always eat protein and carb together, but we don't necessarily need to sit down and eat a 12-ounce steak, and that just might be overdoing it. But protein's important. So protein, we have microbes, right, that help to degrade and ferment protein in the gut. And this is really where I kind of look at our stomach acid levels. Like, are we having proper digestion? So as protein gets into the microbiome, we're further breaking it down in a healthy way. Because if we have more dysbiotic bacteria, if we have poor digestive sufficiency or capacity, then we're going to have larger protein molecules that have essentially get its way into the large intestine, and this can produce byproducts that are more harmful to the body. So protein, yes, helps to maintain muscle mass. It's important for satiety. I mean, again, it plays a key role in just about
Yeah.
everything, But if we're consuming too much of it, then we may actually be producing byproducts from our microbiota that can actually be more toxic to the body, things like
Hmm.
ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. So
Mhm.
I always really encourage, especially as we move into this sort of hormonal shift, this perimenopause, menopausal state, to first look at, well, what's happening from a digestive sufficiency standpoint? Like, do we have enough stomach acid? Because if we start to, and again, which can also often be, downstream issue from our microbiome, but if we're not properly digesting protein initially in our stomach, then that potentially can lead to further dysbiosis and further changes. So if we're consuming a lot of protein, if we're emphasizing more protein, we may have to use things like digestive bitters
Yep.
and other things that help to stimulate stomach acid to make sure we're getting that proper digestion before it gets to the large intestine, before our microbiota ferment it.
I agree. I use digestive enzymes. So every year I take a microbiome test and I see what is the status of my nutrients inside my cells. And this way I can really personalize my approach on my nutrition and then second on my supplementation. The digestive enzymes have really helped me. I've really noticed in terms of my skin and my hair because that's where I see a lot of
Absolutely.
changes. I've been on a hair loss journey for 25 years and making sure that I take a digestive enzyme before my 2 largest meals of the day has really helped me with my absorption issue, breaking down the
Absolutely.
food and
Yep.
absorbing those amazing nutrients that I'm, spending a lot of money on and cooking.
Yep.
So I think that's a great strategy. It's one that I use in my coaching business as well. So we've
Yep.
talked about nutrition, getting a lot of this from the food, and I think the second part of that would be supplements. A lot of women are buying probiotics just off the shelf and they're not really paying much attention to the strains because we're not we don't know all the names of these strains and why are they needed, and a lot of us haven't done stool testing to see what our neighborhood even looks like. So what are some practical strategies when it comes to purchasing probiotics?
So I love that question because it is a very noisy industry where there's
Yeah.
lots of different probiotics out there. And ultimately, I think working with obviously a professional who understands the microbiome, who potentially can do testing to further get like a little bit more of those clues into who may be missing is helpful. But I think it also then comes down to looking at quality. I think we have companies out there that really have higher quality measures to make sure, and that's one thing I'm really excited about with being part of Pendulum is just the nature of our quality and our manufacturing is really superb, and so I appreciate that so much. But I think it's important to work with a professional who can tailor what probiotics to take. We have certain probiotics that we know play a bigger role, say in the vaginal microbiome, and we have other probiotics that we know may be more helpful when you're having diarrhea, or in our case where we have acromantia, where if you have signs and symptoms of leaky gut, then that may be where you have to start to lean on. But I think it's really first and foremost important to find a health professional, look for someone who has experience in the microbiome space, who can really take you as an individual and understand the symptoms that you're dealing with to start to tailor. And that's really where the world of next gen probiotics and sort of the understanding of the microbiome is leaning towards, because we can start to tailor what strains to take depending on the symptoms that people are experiencing and working on that microbiome reconditioning. So it's hard to say. I mean, I don't think there's really ultimately one probiotic. I personally take a couple different ones because, I want, certain probiotics that may help with overall diversity, but then I want to take things that are fortifying my gut barrier like acromantia, or, I've been trying our GLP-1 probiotic, which I love so much, and it truly has reduced some of that food noise and those cravings, like that chocolate that I always want after dinner. I really have seen it change. So it's telling me, okay, I'm having some of this modulation that's taking place that's shifting my metabolic system, and it's really cool to see. So there's not really an easy answer to that. I think we have to, really start to challenge companies and ask about quality, ask about how they're manufacturing their strains, ask all those important questions, but ultimately we should be seeking out a professional who has this understanding.
Yeah, I think that's a really good strategy. It might not be available to everyone, although telehealth has made it available to many, many people. Um, but I agree, diving a little bit deeper into your personal goals, your symptoms, and your physiology really plays a role in how to choose a proper probiotic.
Because you don't want to waste your money either. You
Right.
want to Take
Right.
something that you know works. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so I always ask the question, do you have clinical studies and clinical evidence to back your probiotics? I mean, we have so many companies out there that are taking strains that we know may be helpful, but are they actually doing the studies on the products themselves to
Hmm.
show the benefits? And I think that's really a very important question and a very important factor to keep in mind because we want to make sure that they're working. And so even though there's probiotics that have 50 billion of this or 100 billion, that may not actually be necessary. And it really comes down to the strains that are being used and what we're really trying to achieve or fix.
Yeah. Um, I was just going to say that I take metabolic daily as well. And I also had that food noise of eating. I love chocolate. I love dark chocolate. So sometimes I do ignore
Of
the
course.
sign from my
Lots of antioxidants in
yeah,
dark chocolate. Very good.
exactly. Yes. But it did calm the noise down for me as well,
Mhm.
especially after I ate a meal that was a well-proportioned, well-built meal with all the essential things that the macronutrients, the micronutrients, all the
Yep.
things. So that it took me about 6 months to see those changes made. So it took a while, which leads me to is when someone is looking at a probiotic, and if they aren't going to find a provider, and if they're looking at the back of the label, is more strains better than fewer strains? Because where you worked previously, you always taught me that the approach was less is more, and starting out low and slow is always the best. Because when you start a probiotic, and I want you to speak to this as well, there's going to be changes to the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so you might feel something going
Yeah,
on.
that's not a bad thing.
Right.
So that's like I feel like that's a sort of old myth, where it's like you need to take more strains, take as much as you
Hmm.
can, hope that something sticks, right? Like kind of like throwing spaghetti at the wall. And there's even evidence that's come out now and science and research that's been done that actually shows that as you combine different strains that they can actually compete with each other and negate some of their benefits.
Mm.
And negate their individual effects, which is again goes back to why it's important that companies are doing the research to show that their products and their strains are actually working well. So more isn't always better. I think sometimes it's perceived that, oh, if I take more, I'm going to get results faster. And sometimes that may be the case, but it really comes down to which strains you're taking, um, you know, how often, what combination. And so I think that that's really important. And yes, I always say that low and slow is the key to go because as soon as you introduce even things like acromantia, which was starting to rebuild your fence, it's starting to change the GI environment, which a lot of these keystone species do by bringing in, changing the pH and starting to crowd out those pathogens. As you start to change that environment and those pathogens start to die off or leave, you can feel that. So I think it's a good thing. Not everyone's going to feel it. But it can also take time. It can really take up to 3 months to have that long-term microbiome change that we want to see. So I always say don't judge a book by its cover. Like if you take something once
Yeah.
or twice and you're like, I don't feel anything, you really need to give at least 12 weeks, 3 to 6 months to really see if something's working for you. But then it goes back to that question, why are we taking this probiotic? What is our goal? And
Hmm.
that's where then
Hmm.
we may have to look to different products or different strains. So, I'm a huge fan of spores. I love spores.
Hmm.
I think they're incredibly unique in their ability to survive to survive the system, to get to where it needs to go, to actually change the overall landscape. But they don't necessarily have as much of an impact, say, on the gut barrier, or they don't have as much of an impact on your metabolic. So if I have someone or myself, you know, I'll use myself as an example. Spores to me are great, but then I combine it with things like Akkermansia and Clostridium butyricum, like you mentioned, our metabolic daily, to get that butyrate production, to get that gut barrier fortification, to achieve those metabolic benefits that we may be wanting that other probiotics can't do. So I think that's where ultimately we have to start to design these programs and personalize them so that we're really hitting the things that we see are really leading us in terms of our symptoms or what we're trying to ultimately achieve.
Yeah, just real quick for those who just heard you mention spores and have absolutely zero idea what you're talking about. Can you just explain what that is real quick?
Yeah, so spores are, they're found all around us, but there are certain types of probiotics. So megaspore is a really common one, and I love megaspore so much. It's a combination of 5 different spores. And spores are unique in that they have this sort of biphasic life cycle. So they can essentially stay in this dormant state if the environment isn't right. And spores are unique in that they can really help to crowd out those pathogens and sort of shift the entire microbial landscape to start to produce more diversity, and start to increase that overall diversity. But it's not necessarily increasing, say, certain types of bacteria. That's where you may have to obviously look at diet, or you may have to, again, if you have a decreased abundance in things like Akkermansia, spores aren't necessarily going to increase that per se. Uh, Obviously, prebiotics and polyphenols and what you're eating, but that's where you may have to take something like Akkermansia to complement that. And so I always think of sort of my foundational probiotics, like some people use, multi-strain lactobacillus bifidobacteria probiotics to just kind of give them a boost of these beneficial bacteria. But where we start to now then key into certain strains that are actually achieving certain results. So I think it's always a good idea to combine
Yeah.
strains, maybe take them at separate times just to kind of give that separation. But I think it's always a good idea to take different strains to, again, get the full benefits of what some of
Mhm.
these strains can do.
Yeah, that's great advice. I love that. That's what I do. I take the Megaspore, and then I also take the Metabolic Daily, and they do very different things for me, and it works for me. And I personalize that. All right, before we end, what is coming down the pipeline, maybe at Pendulum or just in gut health for midlife menopausal women that you could share with us and inspire
Yeah.
us?
Yeah, so being at Pendulum, we're really focused on innovative microbiome therapeutics. So we're really looking at what is a problem that needs to be solved, and we know the microbiome plays a key role. So as we're working through products and what's necessary or what we think is really needed in terms of microbiome health, we're starting to build that portfolio. So we've really honed in on these next gen strains, these novel strains, and we're going to continue to kind of work through some of those innovations and continue to build upon those microbiome therapeutics that we know is essential, and especially solving that problem of what's missing or what's really going to help shift our health to a what's really going to shift our health to a better state ultimately. So be on the lookout. We do have some things in the pipeline. I can't say for sure right now,
Hmm.
just until
Hmm.
things are buttoned up, but we should be having some new products come out in the next year or two. And really excited because, again, just focusing so much on the role that the microbiome's playing and how that's improving overall health.
Yeah. Well, that sounds really exciting. And before we went live, we were talking about how women's health is just getting this moment, which hopefully is going to last for a very long time because we deserve it. And I love that companies are now putting in the time, the money, and the effort to back up their products with the science so that
Mhm.
it can help move the dial for us midlife women. So, Kara, thank you so much again for joining the Health Trip podcast again.
Thank
So
you so
many,
much.
yeah, so many things to talk about and uncover, and we'll have you back when maybe these new products are out so you can share the wealth and the science about them.
I'd love that. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and everyone, thank you for tuning in. I know that you're walking away with multiple golden nuggets to apply into your real life. And I will put all of Kara's information and Pendulum in the notes so you know where to find them. So thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Lifestyle changes can be hard and overwhelming to make. By building your support team of functional medicine doctors, therapists, and health coaches, you can reach your optimal health goals. Be sure to check out my other podcasts. Until we meet again, stay healthy.